Hey all, we are talking about the present perfect tense today. This is a past tense. It's also something that's used very frequently in everyday situations. So understanding it is going to be very crucial if you want to communicate in German. Let's jump right in. We know that the perfect tense has two parts, a helper verb. We also have a past participle. The helper verb is always conjugated with the subject. It is also always following the verb second rule. And it's always a form of either haben or sein. The past participle is the past tense form of the verb. It always goes to the end of the sentence or the clause, and it often, but not always, has a GE in it somewhere. This leaves us with two burning questions. How do I know whether to use haben or sein? And how do I know what the past participle is? Starting with that first question, verbs that use sein, these will indicate a change of location. For example, gehen, fahren, reisen, wandern, kommen. These all indicate some kind of movement from point A to point B. Also, verbs that indicate a change of state or condition. For example, aufwachen, to wake up, sterben, to die, ankommen, to arrive. These all indicate some kind of change from one state or one condition into another. Then we have a couple of exceptions. These are sein and bleiben. These two verbs will take sein in the past tense, even though they don't fit into those other two categories. Verbs that take haben are all other verbs. You can think of haben as being the default helper verb. If the verb does not fall into one of the categories on the previous slide, it likely takes haben. Keep in mind, these are just guidelines. Things don't always perfectly fit into the categories. Something that you might think is a change of state might not actually be in the grammatical world. So let's do a little practice. Do you think that they are formed with haben or with sein? Some more examples here. And here are our answers. So that's a wrap on haben or sein. Our second big question, how do I know what the past participle is? The short answer, you have to memorize it, but there are some tricks, some tips, some patterns that we can follow. We have regular verbs, also called weak verbs, irregular verbs, or strong verbs. There's also a couple of exceptions, things to note. Let's start with those regular verbs. These follow a very regular pattern, which is GE plus the verb stem plus a T. So, for example, machen in the past tense becomes gemacht, spielen, gespielt, reisen, gereist, arbeiten, gearbeitet. A little practice, and here's our answers. Let's then move on to irregular verbs, also known as strong verbs. These kind of take a couple of different forms. There really isn't as much regularity as there is with regular verbs. Sometimes it just looks like the infinitive form of the verb with a GE tacked on at the front. Sometimes irregular verbs will look regular. These ones in the middle have a GE at the front. They have that T at the end, but the verb stem changes. So denken becomes gedacht, bringen becomes gebracht, wissen gewusst, kennen gekannt. Then there's other strong verbs that don't really follow any kind of a pattern at all. These ones all have an en ending. They also have a change in the verb stem. Gehen becomes gegangen, trinken, getrunken, stehen, gestanden, schreiben, geschrieben, noting that those vowels in the middle get switched around in the past tense. How do we actually learn irregular verbs? These ones will just need to be memorized. There really isn't a way to predict what it's going to look like in the past tense. Make sure you spend a lot of time learning these forms. We've covered regular and irregular verbs. Let's take a look at a couple of exceptions. I'm going to start with verbs that end in ieren. For example, studieren, reparieren, fotografieren, or diskutieren, among others. These in the past participle don't get a GE, but they do end in that T ending. So we end up with hat studiert, hat repariert, hat fotografiert, hat diskutiert. These are all the past tense forms of the verb, even though they don't really look like it. Next up, we have separable prefix verbs. For example, verbs like aufstehen. These verbs do get a GE in the past tense, but it doesn't go right at the beginning, but rather right in between the prefix and the verb part. And we take the past participle form of the verb part. So we know that the past participle of stehen is gestanden. And so the past participle of aufstehen becomes aufgestanden. The good news about this is if you know the past tense of the verb part of that separable verb, for example, you know that machen becomes gemacht in the past tense, then you will also know that anmachen becomes angemacht. Similarly, gehen becomes gegangen in the past tense, then you will also know that the past tense of ausgehen is ausgegangen. One more class of verbs I want to talk about are those with inseparable prefixes. We have seen some of these, we just haven't named them yet. Verbs that start with, for example, be, ent, er, or fer. These are some examples of those. These verbs in the past participle do not get a GE. They do change form in the sense that they have a past participle of the verb part, but their prefixes just stay on them and no GE gets added. So all these verbs that you can see on screen right now, they look like this in the past tense. They all begin with their prefix still. So besuchen becomes besucht, entdecken, entdeckt, erfinden becomes erfunden. Vergessen just looks like vergessen in the past tense. You don't need to memorize all of these by any means. I'm mostly just including this so that if you come across this, say in writing, that you'll be able to understand that this is, in fact, the past tense of those verbs. Okie dokie. We've covered all the important points of das Perfekt. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, happy learning.